Coming to you live from the Now Media Newsroom.
I'm Jim Check. You're watching Now Media. With me, Ian Burns, our managing editor, and special guest. Wow, did I stumble on that? Jonathan Kay. Thank you for coming into our studio, all the way out there from Toronto or Ottawa?
I'm based in Toronto, yeah.
Based in Toronto, the capital of the world for us, right?
Well, it's the baseball capital as of
right now.
Yeah, we're heading to the World Series, so.
Pretty wild, eh?
You know, I was on the plane coming from Toronto when George Springer hit that home run.
Yeah.
I assume your viewers.
Yeah, everybody kind of knows what's going on, I think.
And I was watching on my phone, and I shouted out, this is a plane from Toronto to Kelowna, one of two direct flights, Air Canada flights. And I was ecstatic.
Yeah.
Paid $8 for my internet pass on the plane. And I shouted out, Blue Jays win, and there were like 6 people on the plane who were like,
"That's it?"
It was crazy, and I was like, "What?" I mean, it must have been an all BC flight, but I was like, "This is Canada's team, Canada's city."
You know what? I grew up in Edmonton, where I was going to university at the time during the Oiler heydays.
Okay.
When Gretzky and all, you know, the dynasty, and it was the same thing in the rink, just like, "Oh yeah, we won another game. Good job, boys."
We need more.
Nobody realized what we had at the time, right?
We need more unity, more sports unity.
We need something. Now, you're a journalist, author, lawyer, and born and raised in Montreal, and became founding member of National's Post editorial board in 1998, and also worked for the Walrus and the Quillette. Am I pronouncing that right?
Quillette, yeah.
Quillette.
Yep.
And written books on conspiracy theories, lots of those going around these days, board games and history of French Canadian. Also, you're here, though, actually, on UBCO, had you come out here for a debate on masculinity in crisis.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
So the organizers of the debate, it's a timely topic. The organizers of the debate, it's a 2-on-2 debate, and I've been paired with an academic. His name's John O'Leaf, who's a real expert on a lot of the health issues affecting men. And, you know, every Johnny Carson needs an Ed McMahon, I guess, so I'm kind of like the second banana. I'm certainly not an academic expert on, sorry, that was a dated reference. You know, no one under 40 will get that. But I'm absolutely not the furthest thing from an academic expert on the issues facing men. I write a lot about the culture war, and I guess they wanted to pair a real expert, the guy who's on my side, with somebody maybe who's going to comment more generally on what he observes in the general culture in regard to the discussion about issues on gender.
Yeah, and we've you did some writing on Justin Trudeau's life as well.
Well, a little bit more than that. I ghost wrote his memoir, which I'm not allowed to say, or I wouldn't have been allowed to say, if Susan Delacourt of the Toronto Star hadn't outed me publicly shortly after that book came out a decade ago. Ghostwriters typically sign all kinds of non-disclosures, and that got thrown out as soon as the Toronto Star reported that I was the ghost on that. So, yeah, I spent time with him, and in some ways, and I'm saying this non-ironically, in some ways a real paragon of traditional masculinity in terms of the sporting life and the hair and
socks,
boxing, the boxing, and I actually, as part of my research for that book, I actually went with him to the boxing ring where he was doing sparring, and he was the real deal. Like he's, look, a lot has happened in the last decade, and I think he's dating Katy Perry now. But at the time, at least, there were a lot of people smitten with that guy.
Well, I mean, we talked about it yesterday, actually, because he put out that tweet yesterday, talking about his 10-year anniversary of being elected. He got a lot of heat for that. But, at that time, the Americans, everybody was just infatuated with him and said, how do we get a leader like that? I mean, there were some pictures of him shirtless. I mean, he was obviously, he looked the part for sure.
Speaking of shirtless, we're here in the Okanagan Valley. This is where Stockwell Day did that famous wetsuit photo. With
the Sea-Doo or whatever.
Yeah, you know a little bit about the manly
masculinity
right?
Stuff.
Yeah,
there you go.
And of course Vladimir Putin.
With a horse.
There's a whole modern,
Trump
thing.
hasn't taken his shirt off.
I don't want to. No one wants to see that. Look, what's interesting about politics is people often want the opposite of what they have. Yeah. So if you have like some cranky right-wing guy, you want maybe an older person, you want the opposite of that. Right. Like you want someone who's sort of seen as more young and modern and Trudeau benefited greatly from being the anti-Trump. You know, he was, this is, I'm talking
anti-Harper at the time, I guess, too.
Yeah, it's true, yeah. So I mean, Harper, I think, is fair. The age difference is a little less, but with Harper, you had this sort of older, conservative, patrician figure. Somebody who, at least culturally and in terms of personality, maybe for younger voters, reminded you of your father.
Very stiff.
Stiff, you know, it worked for him to a certain extent. And with Trump, there was more of an age difference, and certainly there was more of a political difference. And plus, Trudeau also rode the wave of the social justice.
Virtue signaling, all that stuff.
Yeah, which kind of crested in the late 2010s. And it's one of the reasons his stock crashed so badly in more recent years, because once that wave tanked, he had applied himself in such a recognizable way to that
Became the
movement.
Poster boy for that kind of thing.
And so when that movement kind of lost its luster, he had no exit strategy for that. Like, you can't, once you've got all the hashtags on Twitter for the social justice stuff, you can't delete 5,000 tweets, right? So that was the end of that. Yeah,
and I think that even Chrystia Freeland, when she was fired or left or whatever, her resignation letter there, and then she went on that talk show and said that the decade of the Trudeau Liberals was wasted on virtue signaling and identity politics.
Yeah, she's a complicated figure. I actually spent a day with her on the campaign trail for an article I did. This is going back a decade. You mentioned the Walrus, where I worked briefly. And she, you know, to her credit, she's somebody who's always been very focused on economic issues. And when she resigned her post, it was primarily over like a lot of the gimmicks that had been injected into
the taco and tinsel GST one.
It was pretty bad. So she's somebody who, I mean, obviously she had to play her part in all the virtual signaling stuff, but at her core, she's somebody who really cares about economic issues and, you know, boring old fiscal issues which affect people's lives, taxes and spending. And she said out loud what I think a lot of liberals believed.
Yeah.
And that's what got us Carney, because Carney is more in line with kind of a more substantive approach to governance.
Yeah, I'm going to let Ian jump in here. He's got a lot of questions for you before we just talked about Trudeau the whole time, although we can't.
That's fine. I think that's it's always a good topic, that, isn't it? Always fascinating.
I do have one question. If I could just ask one more question on the Trudeau thing, though, is because that identity politics really kind of framed who he was. And then when the American election happened and he came out like basically after the next day saying that basically calling the American voters misogynists for not voting for, that's got to be one of his biggest missteps and playing, you know, like the part where he led in that area and most people had moved on. He was a politician of yesterday.
Yeah, and it's always kind of this weird time shift when what was progressive 5 minutes ago suddenly seems old-fashioned. Although usually my political predictions are terrible. I actually wrote a column, I can find it, where I'd met Stephen Harper, this was 20 years ago. I met Stephen Harper and I wrote a column saying, this guy will never be prime minister. Like, he's so stiff. I fell asleep in the editorial board meeting with him. Like, God, you know, pick Scott Bryson. I mean, I was like totally wrong. The Trudeau thing I kind of got right, because I was tweeting, I said, the only thing that's going to rescue the Liberals, and I thought maybe Trudeau might hang on, is if Trump gets reelected, he'll be able to rally the troops and say, you know, we have to man the barricades again against this, you know,
existential threat.
Yeah. And I was half right, because it did help the Liberals, although they wanted a change of leadership. So the combination of Carney and Trump's reelection is why we got the Liberals reelected. But I can see why Trudeau wanted to go all in on that, because you know that in when people are saying you should resign, he was saying, no, I'm going to hold on. If Trump gets reelected, I got a shot. And he was half right. The Liberals did have a shot. Yeah. So you can kind of see where his calculus was, even though, as you say, the sort of whole social justice thing that he built his brand on was dying.
I mean, they basically had to pry his like cold, dead hands off the PM job.
Here's the problem with Canadian politics is there's no term limits. Like, American politicians hate their term limits. It's actually a blessing in disguise for their legacy, because in Canada, and this happens with premiers, you hang on until you're incredibly unpopular, maybe because of some of the machinations and, first past the post voting, you're able to get reelected with a plurality of like 37% or whatever for your third or fourth term. No one likes you. Right. With term limits, you can at least, you're forced out, but at least you're forced out with some modicum of popularity. And so this happens with a lot of premiers. Dalton McGuinty, Jean Charest, happens with prime ministers, Mulroney. It certainly happened with Chrétien, and it happened with Trudeau, is that because of a lack of term limits, they can hang on, and they can hang on until their reputation is crap. And it's like, what's Trudeau going to do for the rest of his life? I tweeted that, and I stand by this. I don't stand by all my tweets. I do. You know what? The baseball ones I stand by. But that had he resigned after 2 terms, he'd be sitting at the UN or the OECD with some fancy title.
Speaking tours, everything.
Speaking tours, he'd be the ambassador for do-goodness for the OECD or for, whatever, for UNICEF, and he'd, $100,000 a pop, speaking gigs for big corporations. But who's going to pay him $100K for a speaking gig now? Again, Canada's not going to institute term limits, but if they did, the biggest beneficiary would be the legacy of Canadian politicians.
Yeah, we did Level Up here, a leadership summit here in 2019, and we had both Harper and Jean Chrétien here, and Ian got to interview both of them, and they spoke here. And I got to spend some hours with both of them. It was a great thing.
Harper's actually done okay. He had his book a couple of years back was pretty good.
Yeah, he was flogging the book while he was here. Yeah.
But it was actually not a bad book. He drew a respectable audience. In Toronto when he does speaking gigs, he's managed to kind of pivot a little bit to the elder statesman role. You've seen this with Obama, George W. Bush, and Chrétien, not so much.
Yeah, Stephen Harper now working for Danielle Smith and that too. I think he's well respected. He's a very smart economist.
He's a sober guy. He's a very sober-minded guy.
Yeah, he's very smart. Lots of people should read that book. I've read both books, Chrétien's and Harper's book, and I think in Chrétien's second book, he even mentions the seminar we had here. So
okay, good.
Yeah, they were too good. A lot of people in Kelowna didn't want to come because they either hated one or the other. But when after they left, they said, they're both great guys. And I don't know if you get that same reaction from Trudeau. And that's, Like if we brought Trudeau in, we might have to sell tomatoes and then, they'll make the money off the tomatoes.
Then you get in trouble for that. The thing is, by the way, a lot of these politicians who become figures of infamy, they're really nice guys. So I met Michael Ignatieff at a Canadian Tire on Yonge Street in Toronto. This is like just a couple of months after he flamed out of Liberal politics, and this is a million years ago. And I remember he was trying to get help with those electronic scanners that were then newly in place. It was like putting checkout people out of business. And he was making he was buying cat food. And he was making jokes and making everyone laugh. And I talked to him, and the 21-year-old sales assistant, he was like the nicest guy. He was like this smart, nice, funny, former academic. I remember thinking, it's like such a shame these people go into politics because that's kind of what defines their identity. Yeah. And that's what people think of him when he's basically just a perfectly
he was
decent.
Very stiff when he was running.
Well, he's stiff because he's surrounded by 17 different people saying, well, you haven't been in politics for your whole life, so let me tell you how to answer questions. Yeah. And he was like anybody. Like imagine if somebody off the street was put into your job and said, here's how you host a news show. Yeah. They'd be stiff as a board, trying to remember all the advice they've been given, and their personality would be erased.
Yeah, Ian and I talk about this lots, and I'll let Ian dominate from here. Is Pierre Poilievre, it seems to have shifted, from what, we kind of got a raw Pierre that was more kind of like spoke from heart. Now he's kind of like programmed a little bit, and I don't know if that's helped him or hurt him.
The Poilievre I liked was the guy with the apple.
Yeah, exactly. That came straight out.
Yeah. When he had the glasses, he needs to bring the glasses back.
Right? So.
Yeah, if I had to order, if you could order your Poilievres a la carte, I would get the one with the apple.
There you go. Yeah. They watch the show, so there's your advice.
Yeah, it's my advice is it's worth what you pay for it, but that's the one I like.
Ian,
I like the Pierre Poilievre who did the constant shot, the single shot outside of his house in Calgary, and also where he started. He talked about Magna Carta and the inheritance of English liberty and things like that. Quite sort of lofty topics, but I thought that was when he first came on the scene, and it was back when he had his glasses. I think he needs the glasses back. Ditch the contacts.
Not to be that guy, but I think it's just Magna Carta. Someone once took me to task for saying
what did I say?
Carta. You said the Magna Carta, and it's only because someone took me to task for this once.
And it means Great Charter, so you could theoretically say the Great Charter, I guess. It
was King John, yeah.
Indeed.
But for some reason, it's not supposed to take. That's what I was told in a similarly pedantic discussion.
Drop the definite article. Okay. So yeah, just to go back to this debate, it's tonight, isn't it? 7 p.m.
It's tonight at Kelowna Community Center.
And I just looked on the website. I think there are still tickets. It's free. You just have to register. Just if anybody's interested, I'll plug that.
I was shocked because by the way, I usually do sometimes academic speaking engagements, and some of the stuff, I'll go to like a law school and talk, and 200 people is considered a big crowd. There's going to be 1,000 people tonight. I was actually, I'm not Katy Perry, so for me, that's a big crowd. Yeah.
I don't know if she can draw a crowd anymore.
Well, if she brings Trudeau, she might not. But
she's the former astronaut with the drama teacher or whatever.
Yeah, that's the joke. Is it's weird. It kind of feels like one of those TV shows that's in its 50s.
Reality show, yeah.
No, like a scripted TV show where they're all in a room saying, "What are we going to do for the next season?"
Oh.
Like, okay, get this.
Let's do something really
bad. Get this, yeah.
But you're talking about his future. A Netflix show would make a lot of sense, wouldn't it? I mean, if the Prince can do one,
cast aside the last shreds of dignity, it's. I hypothesized, half jokingly, 2026 they'll be on. The two of them will be on Dancing with the Stars, or Skating with the Stars, or whatever stars do now. But I think there's a greater than 0% chance that Justin Trudeau will be on Dancing with the Stars in some future iteration of the show. And I don't have any political view on that. It's just super weird.
Maybe he'll go on a podcast. They'll do a podcast, Meghan Markle and Justin Trudeau, and they'll do a contest. Who's the most hated?
Meghan Markle. Yeah.
They could definitely do a collaboration, I think. That quartet.
Yeah. They could do a heck of a collab, right? Like, who's the most hated in England? Who's most hated in Canada? They could have kind of like polls every day.
This started as a media interview. Now I feel it's more of a brainstorming session. Like for a concept.
Making money for Justin.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll let Ian ask some questions. He's got a lot of questions here.
Well, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, I'm not sure if it's improper, maybe, to ask you this, but a kind of a précis of what your argument is going to be. I don't know is that something you can do, or do you want to keep your gunpowder dry?
I can give you a very concise précis, because the organizers have limited our opening statements to 3 minutes. And we had a conference call, and I did the usual thing, says, well, I know you said 3 minutes, but I'm thinking of going more 5, 7, 10 minutes. So that's cool, right? And they were like, no, that's not cool at all. It's 3 minutes for everybody. And there's like a bell and a light and a whistle. And once you hit like 3 minutes, it's, or a hook, like they're going to enforce it. So 3 minutes works out to about 400, 450 words. So yeah, I had to bring it to my argument to a fine point. Which wasn't that hard for me because I don't know that much, but for my partner, who actually is a lifelong scholarly expert in the field, 3 minutes is going to be tough. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges that I've seen in a lot of the young men who I guess are now the sons of some of my friends. I'm of an age now where people have 20-something children. And I see the challenges that the young women are facing. A lot of it is mental health, social media, self-image, self-conception, identity, comparing themselves to others, FOMO. We're all familiar with some of these social media-induced ailments. For the men, a lot of it is, there's a lot of marijuana addiction, there's a lot of video game addiction, there's a lot of men retreating into imaginary worlds. They become obsessed with UFC fighting and violent sports and social media smackdowns, which, by the way, like, there's nothing wrong with sports. I'm not here to bash sports, but a lot of the young men I meet have sort of retreated into these kind of alternate universes, video games especially. I went through my own period of video game addiction. I know how tempting it can be. And part of it is just, you know, they're having more issues with attention span, more than women, with focus, academic direction. These days, you have to bring focus and discipline to your scholarly and professional career earlier in life. You have to have a plan. You know, at my age, I kind of just waltzed into college and figured out what I was going to do in life, like in my late 20s and early 30s. It's very difficult to do that now. For a variety of reasons, I think women are having, it's easier a little bit for them to navigate the planning and mood control to some extent that's necessary to really focus academically at an earlier age. And yeah, a lot of the young men I see are very troubled. And in terms of the political response, one thing I worry about, and I guess this circles back to some of the stuff we've been talking about with Trudeau, simply looking at any discussion about male problems as, oh, you're just talking about men's rights. The real issue here is male toxicity. You know, kind of get over it. You know, it's 2025. Like, you're just complaining about feminism. You're just complaining about DEI. And to be fair, there is some of that. Like, you listen to some of the right-wing podcasts, and like, it's just not helpful to just blame all of men's problems on women, or, you know, the feminization of society. Like, it's not a useful direction to take the discussion. But it's also not useful, and I think Justin Trudeau bears some responsibility for this, of just saying, you know, that the condition of being male is sort of inherently toxic, and that this is just this kind of contaminant that pervades society. And men should be sort of ashamed.
Apologetic, I think, is a lot of people, you know, like, yeah, you're supposed to apologize for being, you know, I'm a white male especially, right? Like,
one thing that really, I think, bothers a lot of young men is when older men who've been lucky and have made it, like Justin Trudeau, which, you know, he's not 80 years old, but if you're 20, he seems like an older guy, or someone like like me, who's, or I guess us, when they kick down at younger men and say, stop being so toxic, stop complaining. They're like, well, you know, you're doing well, like, you have a house.
Easy for you to say.
Yeah, easy for you to say. You know, you grew up when you could get into college with a 75 or an 80 average. And you got men applying to universities, and women too, but, you know, where, you know, they're getting rejected from universities if they don't have 17 different extracurriculars and a 95% average, and some of them end up in dead-end jobs, and you know, they sometimes succumb to some unhealthy stuff like political radicalism, or, you know, again, they just they spend all their time with video games. And
lost and easily to manipulate once you become
They're
lost,
easy to
right?
be politically manipulated, and then you focus on that political radicalism and say, there's your problem. You're just you're right-wing anti-vaxxers and whatnot. Obviously, you know, these are things to be concerned about, but often that's a symptom. That's not the cause of the issue, right?
Yeah. Like, I think that's the easiest people to prey on. It's people that are lost, right? Because they're looking to attach to something.
And the same thing, and this is one point I'm going to make in the discussion, is that you easily could have had the same discussion about the crisis in femininity, or the feminine ideal, where, but that takes a different form, you know, rather than that be about, you know, listening to Joe Rogan and going on weird caveman diets. It's more about, like, there's a lot of guilt and, you know, who am I? And, I'm doing white feminism the wrong way, and I need to be more intersectional, and I need to interrogate myself. And they can get sucked into, statistically, they get sucked into radicalism on the other side. You know, they start putting on keffiyehs and start babbling about, you know, political causes they don't understand, and, you know, having unpronounceable pronouns and stuff like that. There's a crisis of identity on the female side too, although it takes a different form.
How much responsibility does, like, the CBC have? They get $1.55 billion from Canada, and they seem to be a big proponent of culture wars. They seem to drive that, and they don't seem to represent the, you know, like, the vast population of Canada. They seem to represent, you know, obviously, like, liberal values, and then a lot of the Liberal Party in that. And so, you know, you watch it, and you know, like, a lot of the stuff is they go after anti-vaxxers, they go after all these things that are, you know, like, males and everything, How much responsibility do you think? You've been in media as well.
Look, CBC doesn't promote a culture war because they don't think there should be a war because there's only one side. Look, I was a regular on the CBC's Sunday night panel. So on Sunday night, the national. I mean, no one watches the national anymore, but back in the day, people.
Yeah, it used to be a big deal.
It's still a thing, right? Like there's a panel. I think it's Thursday nights, like Andrew Coyne and some other worthies of the Toronto media scene will go on and agree with each other. And I used to do the Sunday night B-team junior varsity version of that panel. When the other people were out at their cottages, I'd come in with some other journalists. And so I saw inside the CBC, and to be fair to the CBC, they do get a ton of government funding, and they do primarily reflect one side of the political cultural spectrum, the left side, to the extent the left-right distinction is still meaningful. I would not, there are a lot of conservatives who would say, oh, this is kind of like it's an ideological program. It's not really, I would say, a pre-scripted ideological program. It's just a question of who works there. So when I know dozens of people work at the CBC. I used to do Jian Ghomeshi show all the time. I think it was on Fridays or Thursday, before Jian Ghomeshi became history's greatest monster. And I met tons of radio producers there, tons of TV producers there. A lot of them weren't particularly ideological, but they were almost all recruited from the same ecosystem of like Ryerson, Carleton, University of Toronto, York, like the same half dozen, Dalhousie, the same Eastern universities, and they all kind of were incubated in the idea that there's only like one right answer for most of the big questions in the cultural sphere. And I don't even think they thought of themselves or continue to think of themselves as particularly ideological. It's just if all your friends and all your social media contacts and everyone in your WhatsApp group thinks the same thing about Danielle Smith or Doug Ford, you don't even think of it as a culture war. You think of it as, well, there's this sort of enlightened view that smart people think. And then, there's my contractor who drives a pickup truck with an F. Trudeau bumper sticker and listens to Joe Rogan, and he's obviously like this ignorant monkey person, and so who cares what he thinks? Like it's kind of, they don't think of it as a culture war. They think of it as sort of.
Do you think Donald Trump played a big role in that in his first term, where he attacked the press, and then the press decided that they had to go to war with him, and then they threw out their basic values of journalism and just like went after him, and then it just kind of like permeated into Canada as well?
Of course, and the media is one thing. I mean, talking about throwing journalists in jail and stuff like that, and the same is true of academia. So there are a lot of people who are deeply skeptical of DEI. There's some American universities that have over 100 people in their DEI department. Things like Michigan State, is an example. I could be wrong. I think it was Michigan State that had, 130 people in their DEI department. Even UBC doesn't have that. And so there were a lot of centrist, liberal American academics who are perfectly happy to see a movement to roll that back. But then Trump comes in and starts absolutely destroying longstanding American federal programs to fund things like cancer research at Harvard. And you have people who are critics of DEI. Steven Pinker at Harvard is a great example. He's written for me. I've had him on the podcast. He actually has Canadian roots. Brilliant guy, name brand, liberal, who in recent years has been deeply skeptical of cultish social progressivism and DEI. But he wrote this huge op-ed in the New York Times a couple of months ago attacking Trump's attack on Harvard and saying, it's one thing to be skeptical of DEI. It's another thing to defund entire laboratories that are, trying to find cures for diseases and stuff because you don't like Harvard's policy. So Trump channels a lot of the frustrations that conservatives and I'd say principled liberals feel about the culture war, but then in many cases goes too far. And there's a lot of people who, forced to pick a side. They said, well, I can't agree with Trump on this, and so I guess I'm going to stick with the status quo.
Do you think Trump is tempered though? Like Trump 1.0 is, I think, is completely different than Trump 2.0. I think there's a lot of smarter people around him. He seems to be more tempered, but he still has that, that brashness. But if you see kind of like how DEI and that is kind of crumbling in many areas, and like they just tried to put through a UN shipping carbon tax, and that was the Americans that squashed that. So he seems to have. In his first term, there's a lot of people around inside his inner circle that were trying to like torpedo him. And this time he seems to have surrounded himself by a lot more competent people. Marco Rubio, that seemed very competent. Like I think Marco Rubio will be a president someday in the future. J.D. Vance's and those kind of guys.
I think there's pretty much every guest you have in the studio is going to have a more educated view about the Kremlinology of the Trump administration. In terms of like the people who are advising him and such. I keep using these dated expressions. It's like I'm living in the 1980s. You know what Kremlinology means, right? Okay, good. I'm not crazy. What I would say is that my impression of Trump, and I think this is true of a lot of people, is kind of shaped by what happened last week. And what happened last week is that Donald Trump used his power to force Benjamin Netanyahu and Hamas to a ceasefire. Yeah. And whichever side of that horrifying conflict you place yourself on, that's a good thing. And he was probably the only person in the world who could do it. And he did it. And also he did it with some of like the same lieutenants and relatives that usually appear in headlines as kind of in a very negative light. But he got it done, so it kind of forces people like me to say, God, I hate him for all this stuff, including, we haven't even talked about this, like these horrible tariffs and this completely unnecessary trade war that he started. And yet he did this. And I think there's a lot of issues that I and everybody else is like, I hate him for this, this, and this. But last week he did this, and I got to give him credit for that. And I think everybody has their own issue where it's like, I got to give him credit for that. Yeah, but he's done enough of those sort of things.
7 wars, according to him, right?
He's got, a little notch. It's like,
but I see I see a Trump 2.0 that seems to be worried about getting into heaven. He said this a few times. Do you know what I mean? Because in his first one, he was just this brass, kind of like just, like really just chucking stuff against the wall. And this one, he seems to be worried about a legacy. Like he seems to be really driven by this. Like there was a really good interview where you got an insight. He was in a golf cart with Kai, Trump, his little granddaughter, and she said, "Oh, you've accomplished all your dreams." He said, "Well, one of my dreams is to be president, but now it's just to be a great president." I think he's really worried about his legacy.
It's strange. I don't know anything about the internal spiritual views of Trump, but when he is photographed or on video with children, he becomes strangely sympathetic. So there was this one scene, this is from a couple months ago, where he was signing some kind of gender thing or education thing, and he was surrounded by kids, and he was talking to them. And the way he talked to the kids was, maybe this is true of all old people when they talk to kids, because it's, but I remember looking at it, I was like, "Aw, isn't that nice?" And I guess this just goes to how easily manipulated a voter's brain is. I'm not an American voter, but I do the same when I see Canadian politicians. Like, there's a reason politicians kiss babies. And he's a human being. It's sometimes easy to forget that when he makes horrendous decisions, but I hope you're right. I hope that being a grandfather and those tender moments actually do cause him to reflect on some of the really stupid things he's done.
Let's talk about Carney. Like you've been close to Trudeau, and what's your thoughts on Carney? Because he seems to really work on the word salads. Like you don't get a straight answer. Like there's that piece. This speech he did at the UN where, I'm a CPA, I understand finance, and I have no clue what he says. And then Pierre Poilievre has used that, and I think Ian has said it too, like a George Orwell quote. He's actually being, so you can't understand intentionally.
I once saw John Tory, who's a media guy, is the mayor of Toronto. I once saw him give a speech at the National Club in Toronto. He spoke for 45 minutes. And everyone in the room agreed it was a great speech. And 20 minutes later, we were eating dinner, and not a single one of us could identify a single point he made. He was just like, every sentence was beautifully constructed, and he didn't say anything. And this was smart people in this room. So all successful politicians do this. When Mark Carney was elected Liberal leader, I happened to be in Ireland with a high school friend of mine who had gone to the London School of Economics with Carney and had played hockey with him. And Carney was the goalie on their hockey team and had spent years with him at school. And I was like, all right, here we go. Time to dish the dirt. Like, what's going on with this guy? Off the record, of course, right? And this is a guy I'd known for 40 years. So he said, he was a really nice guy. Everyone liked him. We all knew he was brilliant. He was going to go far. He let in a couple of goals in a key game. I was like, okay, that's not really a scandal, every goalie. I was like, kind of like.
He was kind of a sieve, right?
Yeah, I was like, well, it's like his glove side was weak, I was like, okay, well, what else you got? Because I'm not really seeing an A1 story here. And that was it. He was kind of like this super nice guy who everyone thought was smart. And I gotta say, I'm sort of one of these mushy middle liberal, I wouldn't say capital L liberal voters, but I'm typically Canadian in my views, is that if you give me a guy in a suit who doesn't say stupid things, who doesn't think like that women have 3 penises, who like actually gets on with the business of running Canada, which kind of runs itself if you don't make stupid decisions or go on TV and say insanely stupid things, I'll vote for that guy. Like I'm very Canadian in that I don't like ideologues. Carney doesn't seem to me like an ideologue. He seems to be very old-fashioned in his focus on economic issues. Creating infrastructure is obviously a priority for him, whereas I think, like with Justin Trudeau, his view on infrastructure was dictated by what's trending on Twitter. And the way he's dealt with Trump has been really a masterclass. Like he's kind of pushes Trump, but you can only push Trump so far. And I think, to give Trudeau his credit, I think Trudeau actually handled Trump pretty well, at least at the beginning, with the firm handshake. And Trudeau did not give in to the worst sentiments of his caucus and like go on social media and just attack Trump, like with ad hominems and stuff like that. I actually thought, at least at first, that was one of Trudeau's good qualities, is that he was an adult. And I think Carney combines the austere, sober adult qualities that Harper had with, like, he smiles more, he's better looking. Like he's, a lot of it is, who would your kindly old aunt vote for? And like it's kind of a cliche, but Carney looks like a Canadian politician, as a Canadian politician would be cast in an American movie.
Do you think his confusing message, though, lots of times is because of his caucus or his cabinet that have these ideologue views still, where they're still stuck in Trudeau era, where they want to do all this virtue signaling, and Carney's trying to like balance that?
Yeah, so Carney got rid of some of like the worst offenders, like Marcy Ian, who was like Minister of Gender Wang or whatever. Like she was
Guilbeault's still there.
Sorry?
Guilbeault is still there.
Yeah, and Mark Miller is still there. This kind of like
Jolie.
Jolie is, yeah, I guess, sort of floating around in this haze of what she thinks is foreign policy. Mark Miller is kind of this sort of left-wing rodeo clown left over from the Trudeauvian years. And right now, he's working with a hybrid. It's a hybrid of holdovers, who I'm guessing he's hoping he'll cycle out in the next election cycle, and people who's brought in. And he understands the business world. Every CEO has to do this. So, and by the way, this happened, I ran a magazine for a bit, and the staff I had at the magazine, for 15 minutes I was editor-in-chief, was a combination of smart people I brought in and smart people I inherited. And the smart people I inherited weren't necessarily copacetic with my view, and there's an interregnum period where if you survive as the leader, you're going to succeed in helping those people find other jobs. Not because they're bad or they're dumb, just because you don't have the same view. It's an easier
transition.
And he's in that period now, and I think he's going to win the next election, because the NDP has become a kind of running joke, like
irrelevant. Yeah.
Well, it's worse than irrelevant. I mean, it's just, you have Avi Lewis, who has run for the NDP twice and got smashed both times. The second time by Hee Fry, who I didn't even know she was still alive, and he somehow, I think some people are actually saying he might take over the NDP. This is a guy who couldn't even get elected, couldn't come within 20 points of becoming elected as a rank and file NDP MP in Vancouver Centre. Like, I think that's the name of the riding. It's just like one of the most left-wing ridings probably in the planet. So the NDP is thanks to Jagmeet Singh, it's non-existent. So the Liberals don't have to worry about their left flank. So I think Carney's going to be, he'll get a majority in the next election. That's my prediction. I know it's probably not the answer. A lot of
this will be my last question, and then I'll let Ian ask his questions. Do you think he needs to answer the question on, can Canada have an oil pipeline to either West Coast or East Coast? Like, that question will not get answered. And it was that the energy minister yesterday refused to answer it as well. And I think Daniel Smith wants an answer to that, and the majority of Canadians now want an oil pipeline. Why does he not answer that question just very simply with the word yes, like he did to should you arrest Benjamin Netanyahu?
Because it's the nature of our constitutional scheme is that provinces have a lot of power in certain areas, health, education, and in this case, infrastructure. And I've visited places like you go to Taiwan. Taiwan actually has a similar population to Canada, and if Taiwan wants an oil pipeline built, or they have a lot of solar power there and wind power and stuff like that, the structure of their government is such that it happens overnight. Like, they just say it isn't like a provincial structure. But in Canada, like, we have to respect the fact. I don't know if we have to respect it, but acknowledge the fact federal politicians can't snap their fingers and create infrastructure. Like, there's a lot of provincial power, and big problem is your province. Your province is politically dysfunctional. You have a completely dysfunctional conservative movement, and as a result, you have an NDP government that's kind of living in la-la land in terms of like reconciliation and treaty right. I mean, you've got people set to lose their homes.
Some have already. I mean, the title's already been compromised.
Yeah, and no shade on traditional Indigenous rights, which is a thing, but the idea that people can work their whole lives, put their nest egg in a 4-bedroom house, and someone just comes and takes it away and say, sorry.
Well, it calls into question Canada, because I mean, Canada's one that awarded the property, sold the property.
But not Canada, BC. Like, don't put this on Canada, because the historical relationship with treaties and Indigenous people in BC is very different from what it is in Ontario. And so it's very difficult for a guy like Carney to say, well, we're going to build this piece of infrastructure, including through a province that is as politically dysfunctional as British Columbia is. I mean, Alberta has its own issues, but British Columbia has become a real political basket case. I mean, I'm not even going to tell you the things we say about it in Ontario. They're very rude. So
don't worry, we do too.
Yeah, and by the way, and it's also like, you go to Florida, and Florida's like 5 different countries politically. Like, you go to the Panhandle, and there's all these rednecks, and then you go to Key West, and everyone's from Park Slope, Brooklyn. Like, it's just, BC's kind of like that. Like, you go to Vancouver, and even like Kelowna's a big city now. It's the political culture in Kelowna. Like, it's very hard for this to be under the same provincial government, because I mean, the people in Vancouver must seem crazy to you at times. Like, some of the stuff that goes on there.
And they have the voting block. I mean, it's basically Vancouver decides what happens in the province, right?
Yeah, and people talk about the extremism, the urban-rural divide in the United States, and red state, sort of red counties and blue counties. There's a great book called What's the Matter with Kansas that came out, I think, 25 years ago that uses Kansas as a case study in this. That book, What's the Matter with Kansas, like sort of looking at college towns, which are super blue, and rural areas that are super red. Like, you could do the same thing about BC. Mm-hmm. It almost doesn't make sense for it to be.
There's a little like orange spot there in the Lower Mainland kind of thing, and then the rest is blue.
But that orange spot has gone nuts. Like, there are now politicians essentially opposing any kind of public messaging against drug use, because like we shouldn't stigmatize, heroin usage and stuff, and some of the needle exchange stuff, certainly some of the Indigenous policies, and it's become, I mean, it's not my problem, I live in Ontario, but I guess it is my problem, because if you can't build a pipeline an essential infrastructure project because of the political dysfunction in this part of Canada, it is my problem. So you guys got to get your act together.
Well, we're trying.
Sorry to speak so directly, but you know.
Well, I mean, it is. I think the Conservative Party kind of came out of nowhere, took over from the BC United Party, and then it's kind of like imploding on itself.
Of course, but it's led by this guy Rustad, and I never met him.
We've interviewed him several times.
I'm sure he's a good interview, but you know, this is, to be polite, the Conservative movement is very much in flux in British Columbia, and it's
imploding on its.
Well, you've got Amateur Hour, and it's kind of. I mean, do you remember the Canadian Alliance? And no shade on Stockwell Day, but you know, remember you had the Bloc Quebec, you had the Canadian Conservative movement fracture about 30 years ago, and Stephen Harper collected the pieces and made it into something coherent. Eventually, there's going to be a BC version of Stephen Harper that collects the fragments of British Columbia conservatism and gets elected, and all this is going to be in the past tense. But I feel like we're about 5 years from that point.
Yeah, and I won't get into. I think there's an opportunity in the next little while for something to change here in BC. I think because I mean, just my opinion. I'm not sure if John Rustad lasts, the next couple of weeks.
It could be gone to, like, he's got people resigning left and right. And then he says stupid things about it. This woman who resigned, somebody resigns from your caucus, you say, good luck in future endeavors. He got in front of a mic, if I'm getting this right, and started mentioning her mental health issues, which may be real.
I interviewed her yesterday, so if anybody wants to watch that, you can watch the interview with Amelia.
Don't say that. Who says this?
Yeah, you can watch that interview.
And that she supported Hamas, which I think is another intriguing.
Look, I'm sure, I've never met her. She may very well be a whack job, clinical term, but when your whack job resigns from your caucus, you don't say, so long whack job. You say, again, good luck in future endeavors. It was a real pleasure for working for you.
He's made several mistakes, including, I think, he could have actually formed government, because we've interviewed both Falcon and Rustad, because Kevin Falcon was on the show many times, and John Rustad basically Falcon handed him the football at the 1 yard line and said, take it over the line. But Rustad threw the ball on the ground and said, I don't need that, because he left the candidates, the BC United candidates, twisting in the wind for 2 weeks. Like, there was a vacuum of leadership. You could blame Falcon for the vacuum, right? Because he just left, didn't talk to anybody. But then Rustad could fill that vacuum, but he didn't. He could have got on a Zoom call. And he could have said, all the candidates, we could make one party, took the strong candidates, but so many independents ran, it cost him the election.
I predicted on Twitter that he would win because I was ignorant of all these machinations, and he made a liar out of me, and I will never forgive him for that. Because I was bragging about how I'm always right on
But I think his
media.
ego got in his way, right? Because he didn't want Kevin, because I mean, obviously Falcon and him had a big problem, because that's why, Rustad left that party. But he could have made those calls, and then all those independents wouldn't have been running, and that cost them several seats, which would have been the difference, right? And then he stuck with some candidates that had no experience, and three of them left right away also, right? So.
In the long run, it may be I'm sure it doesn't feel this way, but in the long run, it may be a blessing in disguise in terms of it will engender the professionalization of the right side of concern. And by the way, this is what happened nationally with Stephen Harper, where all of this sort of bozo eruptions, which is a term that we used to use in Canadian politics, the bozo eruptions cause people to cast about and say, we need to professionalize this. Who's going to be the person to do it? Eventually somebody emerges, and I think, although it sounds like you don't know who it's going to be yet.
Well, I have an idea, but I won't put that out there yet. But I think a lot of people know that is a very strong voice in that party that's left. I mean, you can figure that one out in a hurry. But
okay.
And I know, Ian, do you have any? We won't keep Jonathan too long, but a couple last questions.
Well, I was going to ask about BC's dysfunction, cultural and political, but that was naturally came up. But we didn't mention her, but we've sort of alluded to her, Dallas Brodie. She's, I'm sure you know who she is. She was removed. Yeah. So her kind of, the black mark over her name, the great controversy with her relates to the Kamloops residential school. And I know that, I mean, that's how I learned about you, is your tweeting about the Kamloops residential school. I thought pretty much the only major Canadian voice who cast skepticism on that initially.
Oh, yeah, there's other voices.
But well, I would say, from my perspective anyway, I'd say of the prominent voices in the media, it's quite amazed to see it. And I was talking to Jim about this earlier when I was trying to describe what I think of you, and I was saying you're kind of like, there's a lot of people like you in England and America, sort of people who are very skeptical and will always ask questions no matter what, how awkward that gets. But I feel like in Canada we don't have very many people like that.
You don't.
So just credit to you for that, I suppose. But what are your feelings on her then? Because she was kicked out of the party because we should say she argues there's no bodies. Well, it's not an argument; it is true. No bodies were found. It was just anomalies in the ground. 215 suspected grave sites. That's considered beyond the pale, even on the right of and the so-called populist right in British Columbia. And then we have the likes of yourself there. You just called yourself a liberal, small L liberal. You also are in agreement with her there. I mean, is that because is British Columbia just, is it some kind of mass delusion, or what? How do you see that specifically related to the attitude in British Columbia?
So this is a big topic, and maybe it's good that we save it to the end, because it's such a big topic that it kind of, once you start talking about it, it's hard to talk about other things. So as everybody watching this knows, in late May 2021, Kamloops First Nation announced the discovery of what were presumed to be 215 child graves. And the media credulously reported that these were Indigenous children who were snuffed out in some way, and then buried, presumably under kind of sinister or secret circumstances. Back when residential schools were still operating, of course, there was a major residential school in Kamloops. And at the time, everybody, including me, believed that this story was true. And I believe the story was true because the history of residential schools in Canada is a terrible story. And there were at least, I think, 3,200 children who died after attending residential schools. This has nothing, that statistic is based on a well-researched Truth and Reconciliation report, and the real number is actually probably higher. A lot of people were absolutely credulous of this, as I say, including me. And then it emerged that what actually had been found with ground-penetrating radar were 215 soil anomalies. That is, anomalies in the density of the soil that is detected with ground-penetrating radar, and these could be graves. They also could be rocks. They could be irrigation pipes. They could be trenches that were made from old efforts to find graves. It has now been more than 4 years since that announcement, and it is now very clear that there are no graves. The Kamloops First Nation was supplied with abundant funds and time to explore the property. Not a single grave has been found. It doesn't mean no grave will ever be found, but if there were 215 graves, we'd know it by now. So Canadian media entered a strange state of limbo after that, because no one wanted to be the first to say, okay, so where are the graves? Are you going to start shoveling, like forensic methods? When are the people in hazmat suits going to come and start looking for remains? And the Kamloops First Nation was very tight-lipped about it, and they received all this money. And I looked around at my Canadian colleagues, and I saw that very few of them, people just wanted to kind of move on. It was like, well, the Canadian press said this was the story of the year for 2021. I think it was December 2021. They said, the unmarked grave story is the story of the year. It awakened Canadians' consciousness. End of story. Let's move on to other subjects, because we're done with that. And it's absolutely true that the nature of the Canadian political and journalistic establishment, we're not like England. We're not like the United States, where there is a critical mass of people who say, well, wait a sec, let's revisit that. There is a herd mentality. And because I work for an Australian publication now, I live in Toronto, but I work for Quillette, I was at liberty to ask the kind of questions a lot of people ask. And I've written numerous articles for Quillette, and thankfully I've helped get the story out. So now you have the New York Post, you have the Wall Street Journal, British newspapers, Quillette itself. We've been a leader in this field, like that have basically educated an international audience. I was interviewed by a Danish newspaper about this. A Polish, the Polish equivalent of 60 Minutes, I've been told, interviewed me about this. They did a story about this. And so the world now knows that 215 graves have not been found. Canada now knows that 215 graves have not been found. It's this weird thing where everybody knows 215 graves have not been found, but you're not allowed to say it. There's no other story in Canadian journalism like this. None. And I think in the rest of Canada, you can now talk about it. There have been surveys. It's talked about openly in Eastern Canada, although it's still stigmatized. As I understand it, people in British Columbia are still living in late May 2021 as if those 215 graves have been found and as if 215 little skeletons have been unearthed, as opposed to nothing, which in fact is what has been unearthed. And again, I don't really know what to compare it with because there is no comparable story in Canadian media. And what I will say, because I'm going to bring this back to Dallas Brodie, there is a way to talk about this and talk about what I have just said without being insensitive and without suggesting that you're casting the entire residential school narrative into question. And this is an issue I've had with people like Frances Widdowson, is a former academic who has written books. She's gotten into all these contretemps on campuses because they bring her to speak. Because some of the same people who say what I have just said, and I stand by every word of what I just said, will also say, and this just proves the entire Indigenous industry is a hoax and that residential schools weren't that bad, and you know, reconciliation is BS, and that's not helpful, and it's typically not accurate. You can say residential schools were a stain on the Canadian conscience, without, while also saying, but 215 little child bodies were not found in Kamloops in May 2021. You can walk and chew gum. Now, in BC, you cannot, because...
And two things can be true at the same time.
In reality. Now, in British Columbia political culture, in 2025, you cannot. You try and walk and chew gum, and you fall on your face. But that's your weird political culture where reconciliation has become this weird kind of quasi-religion. So it's like questioning the doctrine of transubstantiation in a Catholic theocracy. That's what BC now is. And that's how, and so I'm sympathetic to Dallas Brodie because she's the person who's gotten up and said, this is BS, this is nonsense, we need to say it. But there's a way of saying it, and I don't want to be too hard on Dallas Brodie because she's obviously been kind of politically traumatized by her treatment from her colleagues, and she's been absolutely thrown under the bus by her leadership. But what happens to, and I've seen this often in the culture wars, because Quillette publishes a lot of authors who are kind of people who are saying things like the things that you're not supposed to say, but which are true. Those people become radicalized, and they then go in for sort of what I would say more theatrical and maybe unhelpful gestures. So I saw a picture on social media where Dallas Brodie, she had a sign that said zero bodies.
Yeah.
That's not helpful.
Right.
The sign is accurate. The gesture is not helpful. And I don't want to criticize her because, again, she's been through a lot. And she's, from what I've seen, what she said is the truth. But there's a delicate way to stand up in church and say, I don't believe this dogma. I respect your movement. I respect the underlying sentiments, but I don't believe the dogma. And that's my view on Dallas Brodie.
Yeah. Anything else, Ian, you want to cover off?
I mean, frankly, I feel like we could probably all talk forever. So I don't want to encourage us on the forever road. I mean, my only follow-up, I don't know if you've got the time, Jonathan, but my follow-up would be kind of the obvious one. Why? Why is British Columbia like this? And I must say, I've asked myself this question. Okay. And I'll just add something. It isn't just British Columbia. It's also Washington and Oregon and California, kind of, parts of California. There seems to be something with... Can you still see me?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, what is it with the Western North America in particular? Is it because it's so far away from Europe, from the sort of the motherland of the culture, or do you have any sort of idea why it's the case, particularly in British Columbia, that this kind of religion predominates, as you called it?
It's because of vaccines, acetaminophen, and circumcision. I have no idea.
And contrails.
I didn't see you smile until I got to the third one. Please don't soundbite that one without the ironic.
Oh no, that's how you work it, right? Okay. You just take that clip, right?
I mean, I think a lot of it, from my perspective, is you're super annoyed by getting calls at 6 a.m. from people who are at their desks in Toronto at 9 a.m. And you don't get enough sleep because everyone out east this is actually a very common complaint. It's like, hey, it's 9:30 here, ready for a conference call? And I think the time difference actually does play a role in the sense of detachment. But it does often seem detached. But it's hard to generalize. Victoria is worse than Vancouver. I mean, I went to a board game tournament in Victoria last year, and I went around Pender Island. I did some disc golfing with some friends and talked to locals. Salt Spring Island is nuts. Like, a lot of it, I think, is the geographical ruggedness of it, and so Pender Island is a very interesting little microcosm, because I actually did some interviews there. You've got people with $5 million homes making common cause with like quasi-homeless hipsters selling organic raspberries out of their trunk, because both of them want to preserve some scenic cove from developers. The rich guy wants to preserve it because he wants to preserve his view without seeing their houses, and the poor guy wants to preserve it because he's a true believer and he's like into ecology and stuff. So you have these weird alliances between ultra-rich people who migrate to the West Coast for the views and the weather and the bucolic splendor, and sort of like true believer hacky sack types who they end up in these kind of unholy political alliances. And as a result, you get these political ecosystems like in Vancouver, like in Victoria especially, Salt Spring Island. You just don't get that in the East. Like in the East, we have kind of rich areas and we have poor areas, but there are less of these radicalized progressive political alliances that cross class lines in the East. And I can't explain why that is. But it's and we have our sort of silver spoon left-wing dilettantes in Rosedale and stuff in Toronto. I mean, that does happen. But it has a less radicalized posture. San Francisco has this. There's books that have been written about San Francisco trying to analyze this. A lot of this is rental culture. You know, people who rent homes often have a less conservative or less responsible view of local politics. You know, they vote left-wing social issues and then they leave. Big cities that have, especially on the West Coast, that have a strong high proportion of renters as opposed to owners, often have a lot of political radicalism. Portland, you've seen this in Portland. You see this in a lot of communities that become real estate refugee enclaves. So like Hamilton is the most radicalized part of Ontario, because you get a lot of 20-somethings who leave Toronto. They can't afford to buy a house there. They go there. They bring this extremely progressive view there, and they radicalize the politics. That seems to happen to some communities in BC. But I mean, I've spent like a month of my life in BC. So I'm just a complete observer to the weirdness I'm seeing here. But if I did move to BC, I'd move to Kelowna. I mean, this seems to be a refuge of sanity. Am I wrong that like this is a kind of normal place compared to all the crazy stuff?
It's like a pocket of paradise, I guess you could say.
But how do you keep everybody out? Like, do you have like checkpoints or something? Because like, what if all these
close the bridge?
But if you the downtown core like almost went NDP. Like it was like 6 or 7 votes, I think. It was very close, right? So basically that rental population, the younger people downtown, right? And then, you know, obviously it's a very conservative kind of like outlying area.
But what happens if these nut jobs from Victoria try to buy houses here? Like, you're going to have to blow up the bridge or something. I mean, it's just, you're going to have to start a militia or whatnot.
Yeah. I do have one final question, and it is about media. And this is my belief, that Canada does not have really a free and independent media. Part of this is due to Bill C-18. Yeah. Independent outlets are having a tough time. And then, Mark Carney coming out and saying that, like really what they see is just giving more money to the CBC. Like in the United States and in England, they have like journalists that are hardcore journalists, right? Like, and even in the United States, they have Fox and, the CNN, and they have really powerful podcasters down in the US. But if you look at Trump, who they say is a threat to democracy, he's in front of the press all day long. Like he'll do three-hour-long press conferences, and he'll take questions from anybody. He doesn't care. Whereas in Canada, it's very hard for Ian and I to get access. We've sent, 7 letters, emails, and calls to Stephen Guilbeault. We can't get access. And even when Carney was here, we got one question, no follow-up. And this continues. Like you watch Carney walk through Parliament there. He'll basically take a question as he's walking by. Yeah. So we don't have access, one. We don't have a free and independent media. We have these national voices that are very much like small L or giant L, I would say even.
Well, there's two phenomena. One is the parliamentary nature of Canadian politics, where we fuse the legislative and executive functions. So if you're at Fox News and you can't get the White House to send somebody on your show, you can get a Republican senator or a congressman. And they may have a very different view, but they still have an R after their name. So you have legislators there, Trump has their own whip, but at least nominally, you can get voices who are from the same party but are discordant with the White House. And so you have a much bigger pool. Canadian politics, because you have the fusing of executive and legislative functions, if Carney doesn't give you an interview, it's not like you can phone up his cabinet ministers and say, "Oh, Carney won't do it. Oh, I'll do it." Like, the first thing they do is say to their staffer, like, "Oh, Carney said no to that. Well, then I'd say no." Like, it's not like the cabinet minister is going to go off message. So part of it is you have this high concentration of power. Very few people are going to go off. No one in cabinet or in the party, everyone's whipped. They're not going to go off message. So part of it is just the nature of the politics. The other thing is the nature of our media. You do have dissenting voices in Canadian media. They tend to be, it's highly centrifugal though. So what happens is you have like the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star and CBC and CTV. We've talked a lot about the CBC, but Global is often even worse. And so they recruit from the same pool, and the people that generally have the same opinions. But then you have voices like the Rebel, which are kind of like way off on, I don't want to say the fringe, well, on some issues they are on the fringe, but it's kind of like you get these people like Ezra Levant, who I used to work with, who just get so frustrated and exasperated with the media bubble in Toronto and Ottawa and Vancouver, they say, screw this, and they kind of pull a Susan Brodie and they get flung out to the fringes. And they often do very well financially because there is an appetite for like videos that Rebel does. But what you need more is kind of, I think the National Post is an example of this, where it's like a conservative voice, but it's respectable and it isn't way off on the fringe. Thing is, in the UK and in the United States, there's like 50 National Posts. There's like, the Wall Street Journal, in its more respectable moments, there's Fox, there's a whole...
There's Rogan's, there's Megyn Kelly's, there's tons.
Megyn Kelly, I would put in that category. Rogan can get a little weird.
Big audience, though.
Well, huge audience. The podcast thing is actually unhealthy. Like, the biggest podcast now in the United States, as I understand, is Tucker Carlson, who is flat out...
Still, I don't know.
I saw it was circulated because I think he's had this huge expansion in his numbers because the crazier he gets, the more people come. He's doing 9/11 conspiracism now. So, I mean, you do have a very
aliens
unhealthy
as well.
Yeah. No, he's a nut job. But you do have that like super unhealthy fringe, but you also have that respectable core because it's a big media market. So you can have a Wall Street Journal, you can have a Fox. Remember, Canada tried to have an equivalent of Fox. It was called it's the Sun Network. Ezra Levant tried to start it up, and it didn't have the numbers because Canada is a tenth the size of the United States. We're, I think, half or a third the size of England. And so we don't have the critical mass of, call them respectable, right of center customers, and especially with Bill C-18 and the limitations of revenue.
Yeah.
I mean, I totally respect what you're doing here, but it sounds like it's challenging because of the Bill C-18 and
when they take away most of your audience, it sucks, right?
It does suck, and so that doesn't help. I mean, like, yeah. Anyway, you know more about that than I do, certainly.
Yeah, that's, you've been very generous with your time. I think it's about an hour and a half. We'd love to talk to you more other times too, but we do a daily news show, which we're going to start probably in the next few minutes here. Ian and I are definitely out there, but not out there where Ezra Levant is. But we definitely.
Ian, I'm trying to place your accent. I know you're Canadian like me. Ian, I'm trying to place your accent. Where are you from?
I'm from England.
Okay. So I think you're right about the English media culture there, which I very much respect in terms of, you can have a spectator, or you can have a critic, or you can have, like greater variety. And I do think that my own, maybe it's because I worked at the National Post, where all the original editors, not all the original, but guys like Martin Newland, who started up the National Post, were English. And there were a lot of them from the Daily Telegraph. So we had a sort of a Daily Telegraph flavor. And now I work for this very heterodox, wonderful boss in Australia named Claire Lehman. And so I actually, although I'm Canadian, I think I was born in the wrong body. I think I'm actually an English journalist who's born in the Canadian body. Yeah.
I think as well, I mean, Jim and I, we've had this conversation so many times, because Jim and a lot of Canadians, I think, are astonished when they see Sky News or something like that. And Sky News as well, middle of the road, really.
You worked at the Daily Mail?
Daily Mail, yeah.
I love the way they have 400-word headlines that tell you the entire story.
Written by the editors as well. That's you're not allowed to touch them, the reporters. It has to be given to you by the editors, because that's kind of the gold of the story.
That's the art.
But Canadians, I think they look and they see, because Mark Carney, for some reason, has this extraordinary fondness for England and English journalists. He sat down with, The Economist, Bloomberg, Sky News, BBC, Michelle Hussein as well, who's a sort of old BBC reporter. And Canadians now get an insight into what British journalism is like. And I mean, I've got so many complaints about British journalism, but they do pin you down. And Michelle Hussein, she used to do the radio program, the sort of Radio 4, which is kind of like the middle class intellectual sort of radio. Very polite, well mannered, not pushing it in any way really. But she managed to get so much out of Mark Carney just because she's from that culture, and that willingness to just push and ask questions and not be satisfied with bogus answers. Yeah. And I think a lot of Canadians wonder, maybe you're included in that, you think, why can't we have something like that? But I think maybe you have to look deeper. It's kind of the culture in England. People are quite, by Canadian standards, people are quite rude to each other in England, just the daily interactions. It's a much more, kind of elbows out society.
Elbows up.
And I feel like maybe it goes back to that. It's like Canadians, we're streaming on YouTube here, and somebody's mentioned earlier about how, Canadians are very well-mannered and polite and easy to, I can't remember the exact words, but kind of like easy to lead, and they kind of, they won't interrupt, they won't intervene. I feel like that is part of Canadian culture. I mean, and it's a good thing at times as well, but I feel like that kind of percolates into journalism, as obviously it would.
It's a good quality when you're waiting in line at the supermarket. It's a bad quality for journalism. And the root of it is that the easiest people to herd are people who think they're facing an outside threat. And we saw this in the last election. It's like, we're facing an outside threat, everyone needs to get on the same team. And this has been a theme in Canadian journalism, certainly for as long as I've been alive. The idea is that Canada is culturally beleaguered by the United States. We're a tiny little mouse, they're a big elephant. And so in the back of our consciousness is the idea that if we're on different teams or we're not on the same message, then we're kind of being traitors to the cause. The United States is our biggest friend and trade partner. But at the same time, in the cultural sphere, certainly, it's like they're going to take over our book industry. And if we don't have the CBC, we're all, going to be watching Fox News. And so, and that contributes to this sense of the herd mentality, is that if you're not on Team Canada, you actually saw, like in the last election, Liberals saying, get with Team Canada, vote Liberal. Like it was somehow you were a bad person, not because you necessarily agree with the Liberal ideas, but it's like, well, the educated class has decided that this is what the team is. And you see that in journalism all the time. The unstated premise is that there is a kind of officially sanctioned view, and especially if it runs contrary to dominant themes in the United States, is that if you're not on board with that view, you're not just ideologically wrong, you're a bad patriot. Whereas in England, because of its imperial traditions, they don't have that sense. Like they can be more independent-minded because, with important historical exceptions, no one is trying to invade England. It's, in the historical memory of many older British people, that they were literally an imperial power. And so you can have arguments about the direction of the country without worrying about how your traitorous remarks will lead to, William the Conqueror coming and taking everything back. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Although I would say, still people alive in Britain that remember the Nazis trying to
yeah, that's why I said with important historical exceptions. I don't want to be a soundbite. England has never faced a foreign threat.
We do thank you for your time. It's been great. It's been absolutely marvelous. And thank you for sharing all those insights. And if anybody wants to go listen to you tonight at the Kelowna Community Theatre, Ian said there's still a couple of tickets available, and it's free.
So I think
it says on the website anyway.
I called it the community center, but it's the community
Kelowna Community Theatre, yeah.
I haven't had breakfast yet, lightheaded, so anything that becomes controversial that I said, that's my excuse.
There you go.
Keep this in the edit so it doesn't seem like something I said later.
We do a couple of clips to drive to the full thing, but one of the things that we do here that a lot of outlets don't do, and a lot of the politicians like, is we kind of they get the whole thing, right? Do you know what I mean? Like we're also not like, is it ABC or NBC where they took Kamala's answer and then put in a different answer?
ABC, I think.
That could make it more interesting, I guess, right? You could kind of just swap things around.
I think all my answers are sort of interchangeable with all your questions. So feel free to mix and match. Yeah.
We do thank you for your time. And, we'll keep up the fight for independent journalism. And I think it's important to Canada, important to have many voices, because having one voice is definitely not great for any democracy. So many voices is what's important, and asking different questions, like, Ezra Levant and all, the thing that, not that I want to go on another tangent, but the thing that the CBC did, because Rebel was smart enough to get to the microphone, and then they played the card how they felt unsafe, that was just absolute a shame on Canadian journalism.
What's a shame is that it was a scandal. I mean, that kind of thing, if that happened in England or in Washington, it'd be like, oh, look the plucky journalist who's
smart. They would say that's kudos to that guy that got to the microphone, that could think better than the entitled who thought they should automatically get to front of line.
I was totally joking about blowing up the bridge, by the way. I'm using that bridge to go to Penticton later.
You need that bridge? Yeah. We need it too.
Yeah.
You know what? Some people say it's the bridge that divides us between West Kelowna and Kelowna, but it's the bridge that connects us. Famously, one of the mayors in the past, when we were going to unite West Kelowna and Kelowna, they were going to amalgamate. She said that they weren't allowed to use the word West Kelowna if they went on their own, or use the word Kelowna in their name if they went on their own.
Wait, there's two. Technically, it's two different cities?
Yeah, so West Kelowna, City of West Kelowna, City of Kelowna.
Don't worry, the Prime Minister doesn't even know that, so it's okay that you don't know that.
That's a metaphor for something.
There you go. So anyway, she said that, the mayor of Kelowna said, if you don't amalgamate and you form your own city, you're not allowed to use the word Kelowna in your name. So they voted to stay on their own, and they went to City of West Kelowna.
You do things differently in BC, don't you?
That was funny. That was hilarious. Yeah. That was Sharon Sims.
Wow, your province continues to amaze me.
It amazes us every day. It gives us lots to talk about.
Yeah, this has been fun. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Now Media.
We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent. News you can trust.